am going to pull out the same article. I know that Martha Raddatz, who was a former colleague of mine at Channel 5, brought this with her yesterday, and I don't know how many of you read it. It was the New York Times Magazine article, and it's titled, "Why Don't More Women Get to the Top?" And the answer is they choose not to. At least that's what this woman's interpretation of the situation is. And I'm going to read just a couple of things from you very quickly out of here. Quote, "We thought there would be a woman president by now," says Marie Wilson, director of the Ms. Foundation for Women and president of the White House Project, who has been fighting to increase the representation of women in work and politics since 1975. Moving on, "The talk of this new decade is less about the obstacles faced by women than it is about the obstacles faced by mothers. Many women never get near that glass ceiling because, quote, they are stopped long before by the maternal wall." And then finally, I skipped forward to a couple of pages, and a quote from one of the women who gave up her career to stay home and take care of her children says, quote, "Sometimes I worry that we're really just a little bit lazier. But in my heart of hearts, I think it's really because we're smarter." So, I'm going to throw this out.
To the dumb ones?
And I'm going to go right to Jane Swift, who I'm very comfortable asking questions of. She told me that today she might dare not to answer one of my questions, so she doesn't have to anymore. I said intellectually she'd never give in because she is always up for a challenge. Is it a case of this generation, these women that have opted out? It is a small percentage. These are women that graduated from Princeton, Dartmouth, Columbia, who went to law school and had pedigree degrees, have decided and can afford, obviously, to stay home and care for their families. Were they being a little bit lazier, or in their heart of hearts, is it because they were smarter? What's your interpretation?
My interpretation is because they can. And I shared this last night, but let me just say again that...
Slightly different audience today, so if
right.
you were both, we apologize.
You know, we shouldn't be spending so much energy and so much focus, and there are many things in that article I agree with. What I disagree with is that it has now engendered, and I watched the Today Show this morning where they interviewed the author of this article, that it has now become the whole focus on is the whole reason why women don't have greater opportunity our own fault. We are so good at that as women. I mean, I can tell you, if you want, I can tell you the 16 things I've already blamed myself for today. I do believe that rather than focusing on the choices that women who have choices make, we should focus on women who don't have the same number of choices and what we should be doing for them. And I think a more in-depth discussion with women who do have choices would tell you that they, having exercised a choice that they now have available to them through economic success, they also find other obstacles. And so let's go about, rather than, I think what this devolves into, and any of you have ever heard my work family speech, I actually say that I think the progress we've made for mothers is much less than the progress we've made for women. And the recipe that I give is, let's call off the mommy wars. Just because I made a different choice than you doesn't mean I'm right and you're wrong, or you're right and I'm wrong. Couldn't we both be right? And couldn't we be focused on the fact that if you and I had that opportunity to make that choice, and we're sitting in a room this big with maybe there's 400 people, maybe what we should be applying our energy to is the 300 who are sitting in the room who have no choices, or at least no good choices, having as many choices as us. Instead, we expend, you see I get a little bit upset, we expend all this, all the people who worried incessantly about my children. You know, I used to say, there are a lot of kids, and I have the responsibility, some responsibility for protecting them in our state, who could use their energy productively applied. And that's, I think, what we should be applying our thoughts to.
So I go to Madeline Kunin. Is there at least, in a small part of you, a little bit of resentment of these young women who have these pedigree degrees, who are obviously very bright, who are obviously very well-trained, who decide to opt out? Or do you feel that it's an option anyone should be able to make and it should not be held against them?
I feel a little of both. I do believe strongly in personal choice if you have the economic means to make that choice. And then I believe strongly that it's more society that should change. I think this is another guilt trip put on the women, which we've lived with for a long time. But there is a tiny bit of resentment in that I still think, part of your wonderful Princeton or whatever education it is to be a public citizen. And I don't think that necessarily contradicts being a mother or a homemaker. Now, what I hope for these women who are part of this story is that they'll do different things at different stages of their lives. I had the luxury of spending 10 years at home with my children, and then I got involved in politics. So, and I got, as my children got older, I got more and more involved. As they grew up, I grew up, and was able to be governor when 3 of them were in college and 1 in high school. The high school one probably was not happy that we raised the drinking age, but apart from that, and I remember my first time that I left the house to go to Montpelier, the state capital, when I got a call from the governor, and I was a newly elected legislator, and there was a meeting with the governor that afternoon at 5 o'clock, and I said, yes, I'll be there, hung up. I had 4 children, 3 with runny noses, and didn't have a babysitter, and looked in the refrigerator, and suddenly I felt better because that morning I had already made Jell-O. In those days, with fruit cocktail. But, well, the experience of leaving the house, just leaving the house, my children literally clung to my skirts and said, Mommy, don't go. And I finally freed myself, got in the car, was on my way to meet the carpool. I looked in the back seat, and there was my youngest child's baby blanket. And, of course, he couldn't sleep without it. So we had a little discussion in our carpool. I took back the baby blanket, and as a result of that, he's now a fairly normal young man. The pulling away is never easy. But then, what this article doesn't mention, which I think is so important, there's so much to be done by women. I mean, I really think at some stage in our life, we have a responsibility to use our education, to use our passion, to use our views to change the world. And that this ideal of changing the world, it's so dangerous to sideline it and say it's an impossible dream and that we've got to give it up. I mean, the whole purpose of this conference is to make it a dream once again and to help all of you in this wonderful audience to learn and to trust your own selves, your own beliefs, so that you can enter the public arena and still have a life. I think it's possible.
Thank you very much. Melba, I'm going to sort of ask you to add to this conversation, but I'm going to ask you the question, since you seem to be pretty much of the age of where a lot of these women are making these types of choices. Do you have friends that are contemplating dropping out, at least briefly? And do you feel a responsibility to say anything, or it is not your position to say anything to them? And if you do, what would you say?
Well, in my case, there was a lot of encouraging women to be involved and to run. When we talk about all these barriers that women have, you take a Hispanic woman and, you add a few more. And so, things like culture becomes a little bit of a problem where women are seen to have a different role in life. Very similar to any woman, like motherhood, taking care of the home. But for some reason, our culture makes it a little bit more strong on us. And so what I do is I do encourage women. I make them very, very aware of the sacrifices that are involved. because just for the sake of having more women, if we hide the kind of things that are forthcoming, then of course they're going to be discouraged and they're not going to continue. So many of the things that we're doing, and I was at the verge of dropping out because I had to deal with a lot of pressure in my family, a lot of image problems, being seen having coffee with somebody at a restaurant or having a glass of wine during a meeting, and my family saying, what are you doing? Well, they're all men, and it's part of what needs to be done to be part of this. And what I did was I created a climate that was conducive to do what I needed to do. So we gathered, and of course I didn't do it by myself. There was quite a few women that had the same vision, which was, okay, why don't we get a bunch of other Latinas, we train them, and we began to do things together. And then it won't be just me being called to different meetings and to serve on the commission. And so the pressure of, being like the representative in one particular situation wasn't the case. We did the Institute for the first time this year. And right now we have so many different women that I already encouraged. Not only, did I tell them, you could do it, and together we could make this happen, but they're also encouraging other younger women. They're already talking about going to high schools and talking to all the Hispanic women there. So yes, I would tell them to do it, and I will encourage them, and we do that all the time. But it's true also that there's always that point where you're saying, is it worth fighting all these other things when you have so much work to do? And then on top of the work that needs to be done, you have to deal with how you need to conduct yourself, how you need to do your hair, how you need to do, things that that men don't have to deal with. And so that makes it difficult.
Dale, you are an employer. You hire men and women. Do you see certain women in their 20s and 30s dropping out voluntarily? What do you say to them?
Yes, the answer is we do see a lot of women making that choice for a brief period of time, but we also see men making more of those choices more often. And what I do say to them is, don't forget the satisfactions of power. People talk about all the problems, and there are many, but there are also tremendous satisfactions of power. So keep looking for how to use your talents to the fullest throughout your life, knowing that you may have to take some time because of various circumstances, not always children, but sometimes caring for elderly parents, which I appreciate more and more, and all of those aspects of life. But never forget the satisfactions of being in the room, as Madeline writes in her wonderful book, and being heard.
This is a question I'll throw out to any four of you, and you can sort of chime in. The question is, of course, can you remember, or in general, what has been the biggest barrier in the political culture to succeeding as a woman, either as a politician or just in the world of politics? Can you think of something specific, or just the general view? What is it about the political culture that makes it so difficult for women to succeed when it comes to their personal lives? Not, the political world, but in a personal sense. I know at least one person at this table who's confronted these questions publicly, day in and day out. I don't know if I want to throw it to you first, or should I go to somewhere else and give you a chance to think about this, Jane?
I had a really wonderful meeting with Senator Bill Bradley after I made the very pragmatic and professional decision to withdraw from the governor's race. And he nicely called me up and told me the next time I was in New York to come and meet with him, which I did. And we talked a little bit, and he initiated this conversation that he had in fact faced some of the same challenges I did, because his wife stayed in Princeton, New Jersey. I think his daughter stayed in the Capitol with him when he was in the Senate. And he was retelling the tale of this day that he was, of all things, supposed to go speak to a child care conference, and his daughter got sick, and one babysitter after another was unavailable, and he was facing this prospect that he, in fact, ironically might have to cancel a very important appearance because his daughter was sick. And he said, so I know how you feel. And I said, you knew how I felt for a couple moments that day. However, he did not live with the reality that if, in fact, he canceled, it would be a huge story. And he did not live with the reality that I hope you will acknowledge I lived with every single day, that because I was obscenely pregnant at two important points in my political life, the fact that I had young children was not a well-kept secret, and the issues that arose around which I was a lightning rod dominated, and I have to say, to a certain degree, that was an uncomfortable situation for me, dominated my tenure in the public limelight. So I knew that on any given day, everybody wanted to know who I was going to shortchange that day. And that a lot of people incorrectly assumed that on every given day, one or the other, work or family, was suffering. Now, the truth is that most days you can do both well. But there are certain days when, without superhuman powers that I often wished for but was never granted, you hit bumps in the road. The difference, and Bill Bradley hit those bumps one morning, the difference was I had to acknowledge every single day that I may have to live out those moments in the public world, where the judgments, hopefully at the end of the day when my three daughters are old enough, I anticipate the time when they hate me, but then eventually we'll come back to the time where, net, they think they didn't have such a bad life. And that's, you can work toward that. What you can't work toward is being judged every single day by each decision that you make that then gets sort of categorized as Jane Swift is a bad mother, therefore every woman who works is a bad mother, or Jane Swift is a good governor or a bad governor, and therefore every woman who works can't do it all. And so I think that part of that is just being novel. I can understand why lots of women don't run for governor when they're pregnant, but...
So my question to one of the other panelists, help Jane out here, do you foresee a time when society won't be so focused on those bad days that Jane Swift had in front of our television cameras every single day?
Well, I sympathize with Jane Swift. My only wisdom is it gets better when you get older and when your children get older. I think it really is not that much of an issue, except internally. There were days I felt conflict where here I was at the podium and I thought I should have been home. But I think those are events that every working woman, those are conflicts that every working woman feels to some extent. So they're not unique to politics. And I do think Massachusetts politics are different than Vermont politics. I don't think, there's that much prying into personal lives. The thing I worried about most, which I think male politicians worry about also, is that my children would get into trouble, and then I would be the bad mother. But that can also happen to a man whose children get into trouble. So I think on a very personal way that I never really discussed, I felt a lot of pressure to do both well, because the cloud of being a bad mother was always there. I mean, I invited some people to dinner not long ago, and the woman said, "Well, I'm surprised you could cook." But so I said, what did she think of me as, So people do form stereotypes. And because I think they're struggling with their own roles and their own definition, they look to very visible people like politicians for either confirmation or denial of what they're doing. So we do become larger than life personalities. You also get a lot of applause. I mean, I think you don't only get criticism in this role. And I just would like to add a footnote to, the mothers who are going home. I mean, going home is not so bad in one respect. It could be a prelude to a political career or an activist career in some form, because I learned an awful lot at home, and being a mother and a volunteer and being active in the League of Women Voters in those days and other things, and all of that I put to use. And so I think we can't just call this a lost period or a blank page. The big question mark is, will these women recognize that if they're going to volunteer at a senior center, if they're going to volunteer in their schools, eventually to change the system, they've got to get into the political arena to change the quality of education, to change elder care, and take these one-on-one issues and expand them into an area where they can really have a broader impact.
Dale?
I just wanted to add that I do think it gets better, not just because a given individual gets older, but because there's more role models to look at. And I'll just use two examples. Governor Christy Todd Whitman is a Wheaton grad. Every college president puts at least one plug in for their own alums. And she tells the story because her children were older than Jane's and maybe younger than Madeline's at some key point. And she said she would just pay the price. If her child was playing in a soccer game, she would say, "I'm sorry, I'm out of this hearing. I'm going to watch the soccer game." And she did see the results in the polls. She got criticism, but she made her own choice. And then she noticed that other male elected officials in New Jersey were more willing to say, "I'm sorry, I'm out of here to watch my daughter's soccer game." So the pioneers like Jane and Madeline make it a little less weird for others. But let me say something provocative. I spent most of my life studying women and minority politicians in California. And I would have, until the recent debacle, pointed to California as a place that is further along in the developmental spectrum for women and minorities. But why did I not stay in elected politics type of stuff? Because even back in the time I was in California, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was so darn partisan, politicized, and my own background being a Republican background, the Republicans were so far to the right, I said, let me out of this game. It is for crazy people.
Melba, I'm going to touch on tough transition here for Melba. Did you want to add something to that?
Well, yes. Before that, I would like to say that I'm really honored to be on this panel. I mean, I've never been elected, and, to be part of this distinguished panel, it's really an experience in itself. A lot of people think that because I'm single and I don't have children, that things, are easier. But they're not. Because one of the barriers, to answer the question that you initially posed, is that my family was the biggest barrier that I had to overcome. And that was because I come from a family that's very close-knit, and, we're always doing things together, Sunday night dinners, and, all that kind of stuff. And ever since I became involved in the community, I had evening meetings, I would come home with work to do, and weekend trainings. I had to travel to D.C. to get a political training and to do this and to do that. And all of a sudden, I found myself not being able to go to church on Sunday because that was the only day that I had free, and I wanted to just sleep in. So my parents brought that up to me and say, what are you doing? It's you're no longer, spending time with us, and it's not healthy. And I realized, that one of the problems is that we become so involved, and we really have to be careful because then we become an example of what other women don't want to do. All of a sudden, my friends will see me running around, really stressed out with so many different board meetings that I had and so many different things. And, you know, they will start asking me questions. Is this really what happens to you when you get involved? And then I realized that I was becoming something that no other people wanted to be. And I needed to see how I could deal with this publicly, internally. How can I dedicate more time to myself so that I look more relaxed, and to explain to others that it's not that bad. Yes, there's so many different things that you need to do. And so my family and my friends brought it up to me, and that's how I became more aware of what was going on. It's very, very easy to become so involved, and all of a sudden you have this Wonder Woman complex that, you know, you want to do everything, and you know, every board that calls you, you feel like you have to say yes, but it doesn't have to be. It's all about planning and being selective about the things that you want to do and the things that you know would be conducive to what you really want to do in the future.
Several years, well, it was actually probably about 15 years ago. I was talking to a politician, an elected official at the State House, who remained nameless because heaven knows what would happen to him if I named him right here after I tell you the story. He was complaining about these, quote, suburban housewives that have taken over the legislature. Now, as we all know, there are less than a third of the women in the Massachusetts legislature, less than a third of the members of the Massachusetts legislature who are women. So I guess this leads me to the question, is politics a specific animal that makes it harder or easier for women to get involved at the base level, to move up through the ranks to an elected official, because of the fact that primarily we are charged with child rearing, because we are charged primarily with taking care of our parents when they get older, because we are the nurturers, for the most part. Not all of us, but many of us. But does politics make it easier, or does it make it harder?
I don't think it makes it harder. Maybe I'm trying to be an optimist in the midst of the article's pessimism, but and I don't know, how can I put this, but it depends where you're comfortable. And different people can take different amounts of stress in their lives. But as I said at the outset, you know, when I started out in the Vermont legislature, it was a part-time job. And that's when my youngest child was 2, and my oldest child was 10. And I was able to manage. Now, I did have the luxury of having a husband who supported me. And that probably, you know, would be much harder if that were not the case. So I have to acknowledge that. But I think it's so important for women to bring issues from a female and even a motherhood perspective to the political agenda. And you know, in some ways it may be harder, in some ways not. For individual women, it may be harder. For individual women, it's not. I'd hate to reach the broad brush conclusion that for all women it is, and therefore we might as well give up. I mean, I don't think we can afford that, to just say this is an area where we're not going to participate because it's simply too much of a conflict in our lives. I mean, there were 2 statistics that came out, I think 2 weeks ago, from the Census Bureau. One statistic that said there are more people living in poverty than before in the last 10 years. The other, that there are more people uninsured for 2 years in a row, the greatest increase in modern history. Those are outrageous statistics. And who's going to change them? I mean, I think we've got an obligation to get in there and do something. And it can be done. I think the biggest deterrent for women entering the political system is probably that it sounds unresponsive. It sounds corrupt. It sounds like you'll be wasting your energy when you get there and nothing will happen. Where in fact, we've seen so many examples of change taking place. And abstinence in this case is not a virtue.
Melba?
Yes, I remember, I don't remember where it was, but I remember reading an article about women in politics and coming across a quote that one of the candidates for, I think, vice president, I don't remember who it was, but the quote essentially said, you know, I have a brain and I have a uterus and I can use both. And you know, and I think it goes to the heart of the issue. And yes, I think politics makes it a little bit more difficult for women because it's a public career. I know many women that are attorneys that do the same kind of things that, you know, a politician would do, you know, late nights, meeting, not enough time sometimes to dedicate. Like, people want you to be at home with your children, and they don't get as much criticism. But because it's a public life, because you're in the public eye, you sort of become a celebrity, and people become obsessed with what you do and what you don't do. And I think that it should not be, like, for example, my parents say, you know, the reason why I'm 31 years old and they feel like there's something wrong with me because I'm just beginning to date now. And so they're saying, so when are you going to get married? And when are you going to have children? So this whole idea of delaying marriage, it's as a result of being involved in politics. But I know it's not so. It's just, I have so many other things that I'm doing, and Mr. Right hasn't come along yet. So,
Dale?
I wanted to make another point along this line of how important it is to be out there pushing all the time to get heard in spite of the counter pressures. And that is, as a political scientist, I have observed many political meetings where male candidates come into a room like this, and by gosh, they take women seriously because women are half of the population. That gives women an edge in the political arena that they don't have in the corporate world, and they certainly haven't had it in academia. The more closed, the less transparent, the more elitist a given sector is, the more they exclude the new group, whether it's minorities, women, or whatever. And in politics, because women make up half of the population, and now minorities cross many different groups, make up close to a majority in many places, we all can get listened to because politicians, regardless of their attitude on gender, know that there is a strong potential for a minority vote and a women's vote. So just never underestimate just showing up and listening with a smile or a sneer. It doesn't matter.
Sneer works better than smile sometimes, I find. We've sort of touched on this question, but if we could sort of summarize, in a sense, if you met somebody who was thinking about getting involved politically, starting at the grassroots level with the intention of running for office someday, what advice would you give this woman, more along the lines of personal advice as opposed to political advice, in the sense of, you know, not polling data and, you know, who to hire to raise money, but on a personal angle, what would be the first piece of advice you would offer her?
I'm going to expand on that question just a little bit and then address a little bit of what you might said, and probably surprise some folks in this room with what I'm about to say. But I always thought, and I continue to feel, and I would share this, well, I'm sharing it with all of you, so I'd obviously share it with others, that I was a better governor because I was a mother, but I also thought I was a better mother because I was governor. I am fortunate. My parents did not have a lot of money, but they gave me a strong work ethic and a lot of support and access to a fabulous education that has given me many advantages that are measured in certain ways are different that I can give my children than they could give me. Every day as governor, I had an opportunity to not lose sight of how privileged I was and how privileged my children were. And I think the things that I was able then to share with my kids and that I'm able now to share with them are partly grow out of this wonderful position and view, the good, the bad, and the ugly of the world that I had. And one of my biggest regrets is that at times, most of the time, I didn't do a very good job of letting people see that reality. I think a lot of people who would speculate would have thought that I was either not as good as a governor because I was a mother, or not as good of a mother because I was governor. And in fact, I think both actually were better. Now, that doesn't mean it's easy, but I think if you know who you are and you appreciate the opportunities that you've been given and you take satisfaction from the things that you can add to the process, whether that's on a personal or a professional level, at the end of the day, dirty little secret if you're going to win for politics, if two people run, one person always loses. So, and this may not, the MWPC and others may not like me saying this, but if you run for politics, at some point in your life, you are going to lose a race. That doesn't make you a failure. Fighting for things that you believe in, taking value from the experiences that you have, sharing them if you are privileged enough as I was to share them at a broader level from a very powerful position, or even in ways that I do now on a much smaller level, is a victory. And so I would counsel women to focus on that.
I don't mean to turn this into the Jane Swift show by any stretch of the imagination, but the one thing I wanted to add to that was there are, as you know, there were a lot of folks that felt that if you had not been governor, that you had remained, for example, state senator during this period when you were having your children and you were raising a family, a very, very young family, that maybe your political career would have been different. I sort of argued against that, but I'd love to hear your take on it. Do you think your political career would have been a whole lot different if, for example, you had been a state senator instead of a governor?
Yeah, I wouldn't have gotten to be governor. No, I mean, you guys would have never known who I was, and my husband would be eminently happy to have had that experience. But we both realized for all the times, and I said this last night, I mean, anybody in New England knows there were times when it was not particularly pretty to be me, and I mean that in a broader definition of pretty, although both maybe. But I don't regret for a day. I mean, if somebody came to me today and said, we can find a way that you, little girl from North Adams who doesn't come from wealth, who, by the way, is a Republican in Massachusetts, gets to be governor, and we're going to stage it perfectly for you. You'll take time to do children. Well, that fits well, which I've never found anybody who sort of has that perfect situation. I wouldn't change. I mean, there are certain days I might wish to change, but I wouldn't change it. It was a unique experience that I think was important. It certainly was important to me as a person. It contributes to who I am today, and, wish that all of us could be Bill Murray in Groundhog Day and never make a mistake or keep reliving our days over and over until we do it right. But that's not life. So I would do it exactly the same way again.
There is also the argument that, being governor not only means that the spotlight is on you, but you have a tremendous amount of help around you. You've got folks to make phone calls for you, folks to give you summaries. When you were a state senator, when you were a state representative, when you were working at the grassroots level, when you were a city councilor, a town selectman or a select woman, you've got to do all that work yourself. And while you're not the governor and you don't have, 5 television cameras trained at you all the time, the amount of work cannot be passed on to others. So regardless of whether you're raising young children and you're the governor, or you're raising young children and you're a town select woman, it seems to me anyway the workload is not expanded or shrunk by any. I mean, I'd love to hear what some of the other panelists think about that.
I do think it is more of a workload as governor. I mean, you're on 24 hours a day. You know, if somebody escapes from prison, at least in Vermont, you get a phone call in the middle of the night. So this is different. But getting back to advice, I guess I would advise a young person to trust her own voice. I think you can learn a lot of things. You know, you can learn how to campaign, how to print brochures, how to build a strategy these days, how to use the internet. These things are teachable, but you can't really learn what you actually believe in. And I think it's important to be propelled by your belief system, because that's the only way you get over all the hurdles. And that's the only way this crazy system of politics makes any sense. If you see something over the mountain on the other side that says this is going to make a difference in people's lives. Now, you don't always think such grandiose thoughts on a daily basis, but when you're down, you have to be able to say to yourself, this is worth it after all. And to use your own voice, I think in colleges and universities, we should teach young women to speak. I mean, even as I'm teaching now, I have to encourage the women to speak up. There is still this tendency, it's much better than it used to be, but there's still a tendency for women to sit by the sidelines and be the facilitators for others. And we need that role. But see the potential in yourself to go beyond being the woman behind the scene, to be the woman on center stage. And so I think believe in yourself, learn to talk in a public arena, be resilient, as Jana said. You have to be resilient. And sports, I think, for women now help that somewhat. You have to come back. There are lots of defeats on a daily basis of something you didn't win on, and you have to come back and fight another day. You have to work with people who you disagree with one day and will agree with the next day. You have to form coalitions, which I understand from reading about Hillary Clinton, that she's formed all these great coalitions with Republicans. You have to be able to do that. You have to get out of your little box as to who I agree with, who I disagree with, who I am, and, you know, spread out on this huge arena. And it's fascinating. And for those of you who are contemplating it, let me let you in on a secret which the men have kept from us for a long time. It's a lot of fun.
Melba?
Yeah, just to add one more thing. I would just say to not neglect your spiritual life, and I don't necessarily mean in the religious sense, but take time to meditate, to exercise, to do yoga. Those are the kind of things that have helped me with the stress, and, you know, just reminding you, I haven't done half of the things that they have done, but I'm looking forward to it, and I do agree it's fun.
And you will, I bet, do it all. I just want to underscore the importance of coalitions. Sometimes I think women think that it's a sign of weakness if they ask other people for advice and support. And in my whole life, there's nothing I've ever gotten that wasn't promoted by my support network. And asking for help and involving people in your life gives them a chance to feel the satisfaction of every success you get. And similarly, I enjoy being part of support networks for others, because when they get successes, I feel vicarious pleasure from their success. And similarly, when something doesn't go right for me or the people I support, we keep each other buoyed up to know that it's a marathon. This is not a sprint. It is not about me or you or you. It's about a major societal change in this country and throughout the world, and it's not going to go back.
All right, this question. I'm going to start with you, Dale, and work our way back down on this one. Do you feel that there were any sacrifices, major sacrifices that you made that you truly regret because of your high-profile career, because of the fact that you were also a woman, that perhaps your male counterpart would not have faced this same question or not?
No, I really don't. I always joke, well, I never did learn to play bridge. I never did talk over the back fence of my house with the neighbors. But you know what? I never really liked to do that anyway. So back to Madeline's point, you find out what you care the most about, and you do that. And of course you're not the perfect, well-rounded, fit some stereotype that someone else had of what women should be like. I'm so glad I didn't give in to that cultural peer pressure, and that I was a little part of these momentous changes. And just what you said, your children get proud of you later for what you did, as long as you keep the good attitude that it seems to me that each one of us have kept as whole human beings who respect other whole human beings. So I don't regret a thing.
Good for you. Melba, you're sort of on the front end of it as opposed to the back end. Is there anything that you feel that you want to accomplish personally that you fear perhaps may not be in the cards for you because of the path you've chosen for yourself?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last.
Is there anything that you are hoping to accomplish in your life that you want for yourself personally that you fear that perhaps you may never get to because of the path that you've chosen for yourself so far as your career is concerned?
No, I'm on the right path. Basically, what I love to do, even though people keep telling me, you need to run, I like the campaign organizing, and I want to run a presidential campaign, and I'm getting there. So I think I'm on the right path, and I have no regrets so far. I've had some sacrifices, like I mentioned earlier, but I have worked through those, and so I think I'm in the right path.
So you are contemplating an elected office
No.
at some point? You would definitely.
Not yet. I
Sure,
haven't.
or
No.
that decision's not been made yet.
No, I don't see myself running for office. I see myself organizing campaigns and working in the field, but not running for office. But I've been told that many people start off organizing campaigns and end up there.
We'll get back to you in 10 years. Madeline, how about you? Any sacrifices you felt that you made through the years that perhaps you feel that you truly regret because you chose a political life, because you have been in the public eye, and you happened also to be a woman?
Well, they're little ones, but not the general direction of my life. I mean, they're little ones like getting to my son's birthday party after he blew out the candles. And so there were these moments when I really wanted to be in both places at once. But I consider it a great privilege. I know it sounds corny, but it really is, to serve the public. And, I think I always brought a certain sense of idealism to the process, in the sense I came to the United States with my mother and brother, at the beginning of World War II, and because of fear that Hitler would overrun Switzerland at that time. And, my mother said, anything is possible in America. And each generation of immigrants has experienced that, this, and it's still the land of opportunity. Even though it's not perfect, it's got lots of warts, and we've got a particularly tough administration right now, but it's still, I feel very fortunate that I've been given this chance. And I hope, as Dale said, that my children will look back upon this chapter in their lives as something that helped them grow and experience a bigger world.
Jane, you're sort of between Madeline and Melba as far as where you are in your career. You can answer it either way. Do you have any regrets? Do you have any wishes that you think that may not be possible?
I think I probably, in terms of looking backwards, agree with Governor Cunin that there are moments that you wish that you had more powers than you do to do more things than you're capable of. And I would also say that I've only been in the venture world for 7 months now, but that is applicable to many work environments. And that, I think, is just applicable to when you're someone who is ambitious, and I don't mean that in terms of, embracing some kind of power, but you set high goals and standards for yourself, then you tend sometimes not to be able to fulfill every single one of those goals on any given day. But I will just go back and say my husband gave me the best advice that I would share with someone who is trying to do politics or any work, significant, time-consuming work, which can run the gamut, right after the birth of my first daughter. And he reminded me, and I think this is always an important perspective, and I think I heard some of the others say this, that 4 years would come and go. Whatever, transpired in this 4 years, the one certainty was that 4 years would come and go. And our daughter would be 4 years old at the end of that 4-year term. And it was entirely within my power whether or not I had chosen to cultivate friendships of every citizen in Massachusetts at the expense of not knowing my daughter. And so I think if we always remember that we have choices, and sometimes, you have to make the difficult choices like Governor Whitman did, and we all do, no matter how high or low profile our position, but you keep in mind that end point or certain milestones that you want to be able to look back and say, I did the best that I could, but at the end of the day, I lived my life according to my stated priorities. And that's difficult on given days, but I don't think it's an unachievable goal for all of us to remember what our priorities are and to live your life accordingly, even if on some days that may cause a little bit of friction.
And your kids get over it. They do. On the other hand, I'll end with, as I send you off into your panel discussions, I'll end with a personal note. When my children were little, we'd go to the grocery store, and people would approach me in the supermarket and ask me if I was Janet Wu from Channel 5. And my daughter, who probably is tougher than I am anyways, would tell the people, no, that she's not Janet Wu and leave her alone. She was maybe 3, 4, 5 years old. Flash forward to yesterday, we were in Filene's and we're shopping. And this lady came up behind, I didn't even hear her, and she came up to my daughter and said, is that Janet Wu from Channel 5? And my daughter, who's 16 now, turned and in a very poised, said, yes, she is. She's my mother. She works on Channel 5, and she's on from 5 to 6:30 at night. Would you like to say hello to her? And I thought, well, we've come a long way, haven't we?
Well, I feel like I can't get up here after everybody started with the New York Times article without saying that I really had lunch with the author and I really tried. I really tried. And if you read it all the way to the end, a part of my trying is at the very end of it. But I was, one of the things I was most concerned about actually got talked about, not only that it dealt with a narrow slice of women, but that it makes women step into that place about what did we do? What could we do? Whatever. And it always reminds me of this my favorite statement in life as a woman who had 5 children under 6, show me a woman without guilt and I'll show you a man. And I don't like guilt very much, and I didn't want that to come out that way. But, I think having started the White House Project a few years ago, and actually I learned this on Take Our Daughters to Work. One of the things that happened 12 years ago when we first did Take Our Daughters to Work, if you recall, was the poor girls hadn't gotten out the door good until somebody said, what about the boys? And of course I have boys and I really want their lives to be good, and so, I understand that. But on the other hand, what we did with that was not only did we help girls when we started to do that, but it's the only girls things boys ever wanted to do. And so you got something going. So you have to remember that even what's going on around this article where everybody said, look at this, has started a conversation. But you know what? We're the ones that will end it. And we'll end it with saying that this is not about women. This is about a society that has to take more responsibility so that women and men can be a part of the public world and the private world and change our world. So that's the end. Now that you know the end of the story. But that is the way it goes. But I want to just do three things about this day. First of all, I want to thank Carol for three things. One is the content is superb, of course. What you're going home with is real stuff, and that's great. The way it is being done in terms of follow-up, I went and took over to Harvard today. I said, look at this. This is how you follow up a conference. Look at this thing in the back. This woman is going to get results. But the third thing that I want to congratulate you deeply on is last night and today, this room of women who are interested in politics has, by way of diversity, looked more like the world should look every time we get together. And than any conference I've been to, and I think it's great. So I do thank you for it. And I'm glad this is called a call, because I'm here just to wrap up and say, I think this is a calling, really, for those of us who are here. And I think it's a calling in three ways and for three reasons. One is, I truly believe that we are at the beginning of an incredibly new, difficult but exciting political movement of women in America. I challenge you to that. This is what this is about. It is happening everywhere. Not this kind of conference, but Beverly Neufeld, my colleague for the White House Project, and I have the pleasure of seeing this in women who are here from Alabama, who are here from Pennsylvania. They're in Colorado, California. People are waking up to this notion of the importance of this issue. This is, I think, the beginning of a way to get it done, and I appreciate it. But second, I want to say, and I've been saying this for the last 2 years, because at first when I got into this, I thought that getting more women in and having parity was a fair thing to do. I have to tell you where I am right now. I think this is probably getting women in critical mass, in parity, is probably one of the only interventions we could make that will actually change and save our country and our world right now. And I mean that sincerely. That has been a very motivating thing for me. I also want to tell you that it will not only save our country in the long run, but what we forget about the way women do business in office is, how do they do business? They bring more people in. They get people connected to the democracy. If we don't get more women, we aren't going to have a democracy, because those are the people doing it. And finally, I want to remind you why we're doing this. When I was writing the book, I got to the very end and I thought, you know, it's very interesting, but this book is not just about gender equity. I realized, just as the women from Alabama realized when they were doing their work, that I had to think again to a man named John Nesbitt, who wrote something called Megatrends. I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember Megatrends. Oh, there are a couple. Well, Megatrends was a book about trends and looking at what was coming up in society. But what really got people's attention was he looked at different businesses. And he said the railroad business went out of business because they didn't understand the business they were in, that they were no longer in the railroad business, that they were in the transportation business. You know, if they had looked at it that way, what would they have done? They would have bought airlines. They would have expanded. They would have done different things, because they were not just in the railroad business. And I got to the end of the book and I thought, we are no longer in the gender equity business or the parity business. We are in the transformation business. The reason we are doing this work is because women will be transformative agents for these institutions. And so this is for men, this is for our community, this is for our country, and that's what we're about. I want to go over kind of what I heard and what matched some of what I think about the work it's gone, it's over there, the work you did this morning, and what matched some about how the White House Project has been doing its work. we are interested in every level of political leadership and in the presidency. I have to say that in this time, when I think of who I wish was in that office, the only woman that comes up for me is Barbara Jordan. I feel like right now in this country that if there were somebody like Barbara Jordan, I would feel like I get up in the morning with a little ease, you know. And so one of the reasons, though, that we took the presidency is something that's come up at the conference that I want to remind you of as you go out again to do this work. And that is when people see the 14% of women who are in Congress, unfortunately, they think that is fabulous. They think we've got it made. When they see 22% of the legislature, they think that's great. Women have made it. Problem, as Deborah Rhode has said, is not... it's kind of like the feminist mystique when she said it's the problem with no name. Now we have the no name problem, which is the problem is we don't have that number of women in leadership. And one of the only things that we could do to convince people was to take the presidency, because it's the only place you don't have to argue with people about women aren't there. The second thing we found that I pass on to you because it works every time is if there's anything men in America don't want to be is behind. So just say to them when you're doing the work, say, do you know we're 60th in the world in terms of women's political representation? It does it. It's like, we got to get really busy. So the whole movement of women internationally and what they've done, you know, they are ahead of us for many different reasons. But taking heart and taking absolute conviction from them, women in India who rode across India on a dusty train for miles and days to get some kind of gender parity, so that now 1.3 million women at the local level in India now run the villages because they are the political representatives. We can take heart from women in other countries who've made this happen, and we can use, what she said, what does Kathleen say, carry a big statistic. There's no bigger statistic to carry than that we are behind in the world. I just want to close by reminding you of three things that came out here. The first is this business of young women, and the only study that hasn't been cited, Carol, so far that I think you should go out armed with comes from the Center for American Women in Politics. I don't know, how many of you have seen their new study on young women in leadership? All of you have to look at this. What happened is when they started to look at how do we get young women in and what happens when young people come in, they looked at where did the governors, the president, the people in the Senate and Congress come from. And they found that over half of them, or at least half of them, ran for office before they were 35. Before they were 35. Do you know who's in the pipeline right now who ran for office before they were 35? There are a few of them in this room. I'll tell you, 86% men and 81% white. So our pipeline, you need to remind people that the pipeline to power in this country is really already filled with a group that doesn't represent yet this democracy. And we do. I heard lots of talk here, and I heard some commitment to bringing young women in. All the research we've done shows young women don't really feel, as has been said a little bit, that they belong. But the people, this is a piece of encouragement. We found that the 10% of young women who are ready to get in this pipeline really do come from more political families and more upper-class white families. But the young women who understand that it would change their communities, that they would really like to be in politics, are young African Americans, young Latinas, and young mothers in America. So if you... We did this research, and it was the best part of it. And you need to know that young men know that young women have a problem. They don't see it any differently either. I mean, they are supportive when it comes. They say, God, I look up there, I see people like me, I could do that. Young women look up there, they see people that look, like me, only male, and they say, I can't do that. So it's important. And another statistic that you need to carry with you that I found that will work on this is that some of the political scientists in this room know this. Women have to be invited in. You cannot leave here I'm looking right at you. I'm inviting you in, wherever you are. You cannot leave here without inviting somebody near you to either up the ante for where they are or to consider running. You did that beautifully on the last panel. Thank you. But 37% of men self-identify for politics. They look in the mirror, they look outside, they say, that's me, I'm gone. 37% of women have to be invited in. You have to say, I ran for office, I won, I beat I don't know how many men, it was a bother, but I know that what happened was somebody on the city council called me and said, Marie, I can't do this any longer if you don't run. And that was, I wasn't that political. I'd done all the women's work in the community work. But she invited me, and therefore I felt entitled to step forward, even with the resume I had. And I had a good resume. It just wasn't exactly the city council. But I went and I ran and I won because of that invitation. The other thing to remember as we talk about getting young women in is that we are stuck in America. We have to appeal to them about what's great. I love it that so many people have talked about politics is not all awful. It's actually a lot of fun if you get something done, right? Because some of us went through days without that. And you get to do something. But we also have to remember that at the legislative level, we've been stuck for 10 years, and we must fill up that lower pipeline. So tell people to come in and remind them of what they can do. By the way, they are not persuaded by guilt, young women. They do not like you to come to them and say, you must do this. It's like, what? I had a wonderful mentor who used to say to me, repeat after me, it's hard. And I used to make groups of women do this all at once. It's hard. And if we talk to young women about how hard it is, we will never attract them in. Of course it's hard. There's so much that needs to be done. But if you want somebody to do something, all of us know, you don't go to them and say, it's hard. You go to them and say, God, we're going to join and it's going to be great. And you know what? You make it great. Let me tell you, I built the Biz Foundation for Women along with my colleagues for the last 20 years based on initial few years of smoke and mirrors. At one time, I stood up and I said, you'll want to put your money here at the Ms. Foundation because so-and-so, and somebody pulled me aside and said, you can't pay next month's rent. And I said, you shut up. Because if you want somebody to come in, let them know that you got something good. I mean, don't lie. Just tell them what the truth's going to be. Then, yes. The other thing is we have to, Madeline talked, I think, about trusting your voice. That is so true. But you have to remember that we live in a culture and a country that to trust your voice when what you see in office, when what you see on the Sunday shows, which we have studied, which is 10 men for every one woman that comes on there, when how you are reported on when you run for office is about your hair, hemlines, and husband. It's really hard to know that you have a voice to trust. So we are convinced at the White House Project that there's one thing I didn't see on any of your list, and that is you have to change the perception of women's ability in this country to lead. And the way to do that is to keep with the media and keep with the press and keep with the ads. We have a documentary film festival, if you want to show it, about women leaders through the century. We have to show people that there have been women who've led. They have to show people that women, by the way, this is my big beef, that women have a better approach to foreign policy in this country if we would be in power. And that is true. That is true. There are some books out now. There's a book that I almost wish I'd written called Women Can Stop Terrorism. I mean, and he means it because it's about the way women view security, the way women think of foreign policy is a long-term approach to a neighborhood that has to be equalized in this world. You can't just trust a military to make you secure any longer, and women are the people who can do that. So we have to change the perception of women as people who don't understand foreign policy, who don't understand the economy. I love the treasurer of Connecticut. I want her. I mean, that was so great. This woman who has shown that a woman of color is there running the Connecticut state. So this is what we need. So you have to do culture. I mean, come on, we're the ones who put out White House President Barbie in all races. I know it was not a feminist thing to do, but you know, little girls woke up in the morning and asked their mothers, could I be president? Because there was a President Barbie, and as Kathleen Hall Jamieson says, she didn't trust it either, but then she went over to her niece's office. She said, get that Barbie down. Everybody needs somebody who can call a joint session of Congress in their toy chest. So, you know, we have to go where people are. You know, it's lovely to sit there in an ivory tower. We do the White House, we do the Girl Scout president patch too, because, you know, you got to enter the culture and get to people where they are. The other thing is we have to understand the power of numbers. While I appreciate the statistics that we're putting up in terms of electing 1 and 2 women, and we're getting to numbers, everybody has to remember that until you get to critical mass, which I think is larger than was reported this morning, I think it's really between 15 and 30%, then you start to get women who don't have to prove they're man enough for the job. You start to get women who actually have an agenda that we want to support, and we aren't doing it just because of our gender. This is not just because of our agenda. This is because of our agenda. But we have to get numbers. That's what we were studying in our media studies. If there's one woman, believe me, she is reported around her hair, hemlines, and husband. If there are 2 women, then they contrast and compare. If there are 3 women in a race, it messes them up royally because they cannot do it. They have to report on her agenda. So we have to get critical masses of women. And there is a concern that I think was verbalized that if more women get in, they start to back off on family issues. Not if we create what we're here to create in this room. We are going to create such a strong group of women and organizations that support and hold them accountable that there will be no need or tendency to feel like now you're there, you can back up, because we'll be there saying the minute you back up, you back out. We are going to keep you straight to the agenda that we have for you. So there have to be strong civic organizations. And finally, I think what we have to figure out is how, and in this election, this is what the White House Project is doing, how women elect the future. And what I mean is, how are we in this political year going to show ourselves as a political force to be contended with that is not just what we're against, but what we are for so strongly that there is no way any other person can run in America without saying, my God, what do women want? I've got to go to the women first. And we are going around the country to about 5 regions. We'd love to come here again and actually put on the kind of event that will get young women involved, other women of color who are not seeing this election as a place where they want to come right now. Bring them in, get them to register 1 million more women, and have women be responsible for the victory that comes about whoever is going to be in office this year, the victory for women's issues and for women. So we'd love you to join us. I want to close with a story that I always close with because it is about actually what I think our daughters want. And I want to remind you that young women are not partisan. And this is a hard lesson for us. We have to do our work in a way that shows that we are willing to work across party for the goals that we share. And it is not easy work. I appreciate that. It is not easy work to do. But if you look at how they got parité in France, they didn't get it through one party standing up. All the women stood together. In South Africa, all the women stood together. And we have to learn how to stand together because our daughters are watching. And the first year we did Take Our Daughters, the story that has most kept me true in my life when I get down is of a little girl about 11 who was at Brooklyn Union Gas. And she was, you know, at the end of the day, all the women come forward in their buttoned up suits, you know, so that they can say, here are the women of our company. And the little girl had, you know, because it's our daughters, and she had followed her around, and she raised her hand during question and answer time, and she said, I noticed your job was boring. And the woman said, well, maybe a little bit. She said, well, what in the world did you want to do? Did you want to do something else? And the woman said, well, yeah, I had wanted to do something else. And she said, well, what was it? And the woman said, well, I wanted to be a singer. And she said, well, sing me a song. And in that story, the woman does sing. She sings, memories like the corners of our mind. She belts it out in front of people who have never seen anything but a buttoned-up woman at Brooklyn Union Gas. And I want to tell you that that story is about our daughters and our sons looking at us and asking, what songs have you stopped singing? What parts of yourself have you cut off to do what you do? What parts of the body politic are being cut off? And would you please bring your song and what parts you've cut off and who you are back into the world? And that's what this work is about, for our children to see that we will no longer cut off any part of the body politic of this country for the sake of their lives and their future. And I thank you deeply, every one of you, for the work you do every day, wherever you do it. Help it happen.